Hey guys, welcome to this special episode. With me today, I have Nathan Paine. And Nathan, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and things like that.
I am a director of photography. My experience is mostly narrative. Um, do a lot of work in shorts and features. Um, I've kind of come up in the feature world. I started in camera, did several features there, and I've spent the last couple of years kind of doing a lot of what we call grip and electric in the live action feature world, which is lighting, for lack of a
Mhm.
better term. And so I'm coming to DPing with experience from all three of those departments. Um, in narrative, not so much documentary, though maybe one day. Um, so this is kind of my bread and butter is lighting and camera for story. So very excited to jump into this situation. Yeah.
Awesome. Now, for those who are watching this and less familiar with the terminology, of course, you explained that it's grip and electric. Basically, it means
Yes.
lighting to the layman.
On the
And
big shows, they are two separate departments, but a lot of
okay.
times on smaller things, or kind of the run and gun, low budget that we're used to, camera and grip and electric can all actually run together.
Right.
So,
Exactly. Now, how would you distinguish again for those who are less familiar with the terminology? How would you distinguish camera from director of photography or DP?
uh, a director of photography kind of exists outside of a department, if you will. So, the director of photography in a perfect world would, in fact, be in charge of three separate departments. So, you have your um, camera operators and your assistant cameraman in the camera department. And on low budget stuff, your DP is probably also your camera operator. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
overlap there. And it's why a lot of people kind of associate the director of photography primarily with camera, is because the chain of command kind of works there. But the director of photography is also over the gaffer, who is the chief lighting technician, and the lighting technicians under him, and he's also over the key grip and the grips as well. Um, and those two have unique responsibilities, and then they also collaborate on lighting. So a lot of times on kind of super low budget stuff, all three of those groups kind of start running together. And then in the middle tier, you kind of have camera, and then you have lighting. And the grips and electrics will kind of be the same people. And then when you get to another higher budget, the grip and electric departments will split again to be separate. So in a perfect world, the cinematographer is in fact controlling the camera placement and camera movement, and is in charge of why we choose to use the settings that we do, or the lenses that we do, or the camera that we do, and where we put it. And it is also in charge of how we light the scene. And then
Mhm.
the grips also have this added subcategory of being support for other departments. So the grips will often do a lot of rigging, and they can help other departments, even not under the DP, but a lot of times they're involved with camera movement as well. So like dollies or car rigging or things like that would fall into grip. So it's all kind of a balance of parting out responsibilities that all fall under this director of photography.
Right. So basically, he'd be sort of above that, and then typically speaking, I guess the director would kind of you'd have director, producer, and I'm sure even that depends on the production and just the hierarchy
Hmm.
of every individual team.
Correct.
Right. Awesome. So yeah, with that, I've asked Nathan to come on and basically give me advice and direction and tips for a short film I'm working on. I've done a lot of study in animation, a lot of study into a lot of these aspects, but it's one of those things. We were talking before recording, just that it's easy to know a lot of the terms and sort of the kind of the available tools or even the general possibilities, but that's quite different from making decisions about, okay, in this particular short film or scene, what specific choices are we going to use and why? Nathan, I like how you put it about you really want to get into the story side of things, and that really is going to determine both the tool set and the artistic choices.
Right.
Yeah. So very cool. So the way we'll proceed in this would be here is the scene. I'll just give a quick overview and we'll come back to this. But here's our scene. We have daytime lighting, pretty bright. We have a couple characters and some basic lighting setups. I'll get into this a little bit more, but I know that we definitely need, like, if I switch over to this camera angle, this needs lots of work. And there's a couple issues that I noticed when rendering out. The lights are a little bit too yellow. There's the positioning needs some work, and so there's a lot of things we can take a look at. But yeah, this is our basic scene, and we'll get into some of the other things I've set up in just a second. But before we do that, I want to give a rundown of Blender in particular and some of the lighting options that we have, lighting camera. And Nathan, that will, just so I know, remind me, do you have any practice or familiarity with using either Blender or any 3D software?
I excuse me. I dabbled in the past in 3ds Max and Maya. Before deciding that I was thoroughly out of my depth. And just to preface, I started my career actually in visual effects.
Nice.
So I started as a rotoscope artist and match mover, and then I became a compositor. And then I decided that, in fact, I enjoyed working with people more than sitting in an office. So then I started my journey into being on set. But that has afforded me a little bit of understanding as far as how to not shoot myself in the foot while shooting things that might have visual effects going on. So I do know a little bit about just the type of light sources that can be generated and similar things like that. I will have some more specific questions when it comes to specifically, I guess, what we would call in the real world negative fill. But I don't know if there's an applicable idea inside of some of these softwares, or if you sort of have to jerry rig it. But basically the idea is, a lot of times in the real world, we'll set a light and then we will try to make shadows afterwards. And we do that by setting large frames or flags with solid pieces of cloth that light can't penetrate around to help kind of what we would call shape the light. Because oftentimes when you just put a bare unit in a space and just shine the light, that's great and all, but it has to be shaped and directed, because we don't always want that light to hit everything. It's for a specific purpose usually. So I don't know quite how that will work in 3D. I'm sure there's a method to be able to kind of work around it, but we shall see.
Yeah, we'll get to setting up a basic flag and some of the options there for sure. But yeah, I love how you mentioned it's one of those things that I think a lot of times we miss for both movies or photography, that when we're adding professional lighting, there's a lot of lighting detail there, that it's not just like you set up a
it's not just exposure,
It's not just exposure. It's not like you just set up 3 lights and then suddenly everything works. I mean, maybe in some rare cases.
Dude, that would be a dream.
Maybe in some rare cases it would be, maybe for like some studio setups, if you're doing like a product picture, even that, chances are you're going to have to move the lights around a little bit to really highlight your object. So it's one of those things. I think it's easy to forget that, professional lighting takes a lot of work, and there's so much more detail there. And that's one of the reasons why a movie with really good professional lighting looks different than if you just take a phone camera and snap a random picture. That's one of the, I don't know if, I guess I could say primary reasons, at least when it comes to the lighting, That's the primary reason why it looks so different. And if you've ever wondered, okay,
I would agree.
why are there differences here? That's definitely it.
Yeah, I know people ask me all the time, like, what camera did you shoot that on? And like, that's not an interesting question to me
Right.
anymore. It's like, you can shoot it on your iPhone now. It's actually, you can shoot in 4K and in slow motion. You have all these objects. But if you're not lighting it and picking your angles well, that's where the difference is going to be.
Exactly, exactly. So yeah, jumping here for some of the simple. I'll actually give a rundown of the camera because I think that will be a little bit faster. So we have a lot of the same options for the camera like you would on a typical digital camera. So we have the focal length, which
Okay.
of course we can adjust. If we really want to get specific, I don't know if we'll be doing this today. I usually use the default, but we even have options for doing like the sensor size, and I think it lets us determine that. I want to say there's an option for doing the width and height independent, but maybe that's not an option currently. But theoretically, and that's something that in some ways might be minor in some cases, but if we wanted to, especially if we wanted to match like existing footage, something like this probably would
Correct.
be a lot more critical.
Yeah,
Um,
so when we get into the camera, I will probably dictate a few settings to you just
sure.
so that my lens terminology and the things that I'll be thinking about match. But we'll talk about that when we sort of start the conversation as a director and DP when we get into how we shoot it.
Cool. A couple other options. We have the horizontal and vertical shift. Because we're not doing architecture stuff, I don't think that will be needed, but that is an option. Um, Something that is unique, and I'll go ahead and mention this. Something that is more unique to 3D is the possibility of doing a clip start and end. So this can be valuable. Actually, let me show what it is and then why it's valuable. So let's imagine we have a very simple box here, and this represents a room. And if we have our camera outside of this box and we have the subject matter inside of this, let me see if I can zoom into everything's a little bit big and it's hard to navigate here. But let's say we have this as our room, and for whatever reason, we need the camera to be back here. Well, we could, if treating this like a movie set, we might remove these sides of this cube and treat it like a studio piece where we have the different walls and ceiling and the floor. And that's one way we could do things. But another option, which allows us to not have to modify our room geometry, is to use a clip start. And this may not work in every case, but what this allows us to do is essentially, it's really hard to describe exactly, but you can kind of see what's going on here. It's like we only start the rendering at a certain point in space away from the camera.
Ah, interesting.
So there's probably some, camera angles and things where this wouldn't work well as an option, but there are a fair number of situations where it does. And there's two sides to this. One, it allows us to not have to delete or hide any
Right.
geometry. But the other thing is if for whatever reason we want the lighting to be
Right. It won't
realistic,
affect your lighting.
right, or to have something that is basically consistent with the physical aspects. So for example, if we remove these walls, of course, none of that light that would be bouncing on those walls, none of that light's bouncing back inside
Right.
of this. And there technically would be probably even a third option of hiding the walls in and setting up some render settings for hiding them, but still having them bounce the light. But that takes a few more steps, but that's also a
Right.
possibility. But that's outside of the camera itself. And for simplicity, I may just even leave those walls off. But that's a available option. Now here's where things kind of deviate from a typical camera setup in the real world. Exposure and the depth of field inside of 3D can actually be segmented. I
Right.
don't think you can do that in real life because of the
Definitely not.
physics because of the
If you
physics.
know of a way to separate the physics of photons from physical parameters, you let me know, because that will be really interesting.
Yeah.
But until we can separate the physicality of light from hitting a medium, then we're stuck with those things being connected.
Right. And so what Nathan and I are referring to is let me see if, in fact, I might even delete this and do something really basic here and create a second set of a cube in the background, a cube in a plane, and let's see if we can angle this real quick. And let's imagine for a second that I wanted to get the camera effect. In fact, I'm already getting it a little bit because I turned the depth of field option on. And that is, let's say I want this object to be in focus and this object to be blurred. Well, let's see. I think, trying to remember, here we go, I have the limits. So I can turn on this option and it lets me see my exact point of focus. So in this case, I'm going to set the distance to about there. And so now we can see, okay, this anything along this plane should be in perfect focus. Anything beyond or in front is not going to be so much in focus. Now, I'm going to cheat things a little bit. I'm going to dial this down, probably even ridiculously so, just so we can see the effect. But now we can see, if I hide that, the background object is blurry and the foreground object is in focus. And I'm not sure that I could personally explain the physics behind that, but suffice it to say that it exists in the real world, and so it's often used in the real world artistically to draw the viewer's eye to an object they want, that the director might want the audience to see, or maybe even to obscure something, and is also, I've found, especially for maybe more so for photography, kind of gives it the professional look. I mean, it's amazing how much we pay for lenses to blur out the background.
Some of that is a holdover from the days of shooting film stock, when the film stock itself would actually be quite what we would call slow, but not as sensitive to light. And so needing a really large aperture was absolutely necessary to be able to do documentary work or things where you couldn't afford to light as much. And nowadays, because of the sensitivity of a digital sensor over celluloid, aperture is definitely much more in the camp of preference and artistic taste than it is necessity, like it was once upon a time. But I do agree. I think the physics of optics and the circle of confusion and similar phenomena are beyond the scope of this video. But if your audience wishes to know things, then there is plenty of material on the internet that is much better presented than I could on how exactly that all works and whatnot. But suffice to say, something is going to be in focus and something is going to be out of focus, and we can use that ability for art.
Exactly, yeah. And of course, this, ideally we'd have something more interesting in the background to blur out and get the, because Blender does a pretty good job. It's interesting because you can do a two-dimensional, like, composited, photoshopped version of the book of bokeh and have that depth of field. But when you render it in frame, the advantage is you get things like the physical behavior that you'd expect, and that I think just some of the Photoshop options just don't have. If I remember correctly, some of it is even things like that you might have circles of light, but those, of course, are going to be cut off by I don't know, that I may be confusing some of the options with motion blur, because you might be able to get it fairly similar, but I believe there are some.
There should be ways to replicate a lot of the physics of how an optic has to exist in the real world. A lot of times what happens is that you're limited by the physical constraints of the housing. So the pieces of glass sit in a metal tube, basically. And that metal tube does, in fact, impart characteristics on the lens, and a lot of times what you'll see is I think what you're referring to is you'll start to see the circles not be circles when they start getting to the edge. A lot of times they'll bend or change into different shapes, and a lot of 3D softwares now can physically mimic just real world artifacts. So even though it's not perfect or even necessary, they're getting to the point where they're doing really complicated physics sims inside of these programs so that you can start to replicate what honestly problems that we deal with in the real world, which I think is super fun. And it also means that you can, with an understanding of the tools, begin to really, really make it very hard for even a discerning eye to notice what is real and what is fake, which is, I think, the advantage is that you can start to mix this footage with live action footage now.
Right.
And you'd never know. Or at least match your live action footage for aesthetic,
Sure.
similarity.
Right. So suffice it to say, though, an important factor is, and if I think I have this right, but basically the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. So basically, we're simulating. As we go down. Of course, we're taking this a little bit smaller than what we'd typically get in real life. However, that might work if we're simulating like almost like a miniature, because if you ever have like movies that where you're filming, or stop motion is a great example, then you tend to get shallow depths of field for that reason. And of course we have some other options, but the main thing to take into account is the distance, and so that's basically where our camera is focused. We can even actually snap that to an object, so that if our object moves around, it's always in focus, which we might want, but we could also choose to artistically not have the match exactly to emulate the way we might pull focus in a real situation where a character is moving. I don't think we'll really need that in this particular example, but it's a cool option to have available.
Yeah, judging by the script in this case, I would probably venture to say that there's no real reason to not have the subject, the focus be where you would think that it would be.
Right.
But you never know.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I think that's pretty much it for the camera. There's actually a couple different ways. I won't get into the technical side. There's a couple different ways of doing exposure inside Blender, but the easiest one is just to go to the render settings and adjust the exposure. Now there are some plugins that map like presumably real world values, and I don't know how closely they match, if they're mathematically correct or just rough approximations, but ways to basically tie the exposure a little bit closer to the aperture and the shutter speed and the basically a simulated ISO. But in this case, because of what we're doing, I don't know that we'll dig into that because that requires external plugins. But it's cool.
And honestly, that's fine for us, because generally speaking, I would know the kind of look that I'm going for, and I know enough to be able to tell you which settings that I would like one way, and then we can just make the exposure work
right
after that. So we don't need to physically emulate how a camera works in this particular case.
Right. All right, let's go into lighting. Now we have Blender provides us with 5 main types of lights and then a background light. So the 4 main types, actually there's 4 main types and then a third that works a little bit different. So I have a point light here, which essentially simulates a sphere. In fact, that could be, you don't see it in the render view, but imagine if I were to turn this material into a mirror. Let's see, metal and roughness is down. Then you can really quickly see we have this light here reflected in this, what's now a mirror surface. And of course, we can change the radius, which changes the size of that. It used to be that point lights inside of a lot of 3D programs were from a single infinitely small point, which, I think made sense back in the day, but there's not really any level of realism that you get out of that. So having a sphere gives it a little bit more, gives the material something to reflect. So for example, if I increase the roughness, and I know we're not really talking about materials today, but of course, materials and lighting work together, and so it's hard to really separate those entirely. So if I increase the roughness, we of course have that sphere, but now it's all blurred because our material is much more rough. And of course, we can change the metallic and the amount of glossy reflection as well. And also feel free to interrupt me and ask questions about any of these as well. We have a power, presumably that's tied to some real world value. The problem is I don't think that it's not the equivalent of like a light power. I think it's equivalent of the actual one-to-one energy. So basically, if you had a perfectly, I think it represents if you had something that was perfectly energy efficient, I think it would represent that value. But of course, in real life,
that's interesting. It's kind of a weird concept because for me to be able to use a wattage, which is what they're looking at here,
right, yeah.
to be able to guess what kind of units I would use in the real world, I would then have to also use camera settings like I would in the real world for exposure, because otherwise it almost makes no difference. But one note that we will make, and the way that I'm going to use these sort of not real metrics to be able to arrive at something that is similar to the real world is just looking at ratios.
Right,
so
yeah.
A lot of times it's like, hey, in this case, I want this other light to be twice as bright.
Right.
So it doesn't matter what the value is, as long as they're relative to each other, they're where I need them to be,
Excellent point. Yeah. It's definitely helpful to think about that side of things. One day, I've tried to figure out like what's the ratio. I mean, honestly, I think what's the ratio to like a real life, maybe even like an incandescent bulb that's what do they used to make those in? 65 watts? Is that right?
I mean, they make them in every conceivable wattage, really.
Sure, yeah. It's been so long, like everything's switched to the LEDs nowadays, it seems, but yeah. So like I think you do have to factor in the inefficiency, but like you said, just having the ratios and be able to figure that out certainly provides a lot of feedback. Now there is, if we get real deep, we can start doing things like turning off shadows and stuff. I don't think we'll need that. I in particular prefer not to mess with the physics any more than I have to. But those options do exist if we wanted to get kind of crazy. We also have the color, which we can change to a bunch of things. And also, if we want to have something that's a little bit more based in what we might use in real life, we could set this to use a black body and set the color temperature to something like, in this case, 5,000, or whatever the case might be.
And just for the ease of my use, that's probably how I would do this. Just because I don't know code values for for kind of lighting temperatures. So if we get into changing them all off of any standardized setting, then that would probably be my preferred method.
Now tell me, what's the typical daylight color? Is that
5600?
Now is that supposed to be bluish? Well, I guess that's bluish.
It is a lot of people's reference for a starting point for white.
Right.
Though if you actually break it down, it's kind of a misnomer in a way, because even though that is the temperature at which the sun burns, which is a lot of where we arrive at that number,
right,
what's actually happening when you collect that white point is you're getting a lot of blue fill from the sky,
right,
and then the sun is actually warmer than that. So a lot of times we'll actually have multiple color sources on set if we're trying to go for a daylight look. So that the actual unit that's replicating the hard shadows of the sun might be warmer, and then we have a cooler or white fill. And there's a lot you can do to kind of play in that creatively, and that effect gets more enhanced in the real world near sunrise and sunset because of the physics of the atmosphere. Just suffice it to say that the sun will appear more golden in the morning and evening, and consequently, then the difference between the sky is also more drastic. So if you go outside during sunset and you look at the sun, it's super warm, and if you look in the shadow side of something, it's going to be almost blue. So that's where you get that kind of golden teal look that a lot of people are after, is actually based in reality. We just kind of do the human thing and overdo it sometimes. But the composite number for all of that is 56. So a lot of people start there, and a lot of LEDs live comfortably in that space. So for a starting point for us, that would be a great first number, and then we tweak to taste.
Right. That actually makes me think of something. And of course, for a bunch of reasons, historically, 3D renderers typically use a red, green, blue system under the hood, which gives us a lot of what we need color-wise, because the end product is going to be red, green, and blue. However, it is something that, based on just some looking at some examples and things, the real world, of course, has a full spectrum of light. And there's all the physics that go into, and even like I've studied that a little bit and realized, oh man, this is so much like color to me is one of the most.
It is a can of worms to dive into.
We'll have to one day. I'll have to do like a whole conference on that. It's like try to figure out, bring brilliant minds together and try to figure this out. But I guess
hey, if you want to get a little bit into it at some other time, I'm more than happy to talk, because that's also an area of special interest of mine, just because of all the LED lights that we use now also operate in a red, green, blue system.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
We'll have to talk about that.
Yeah. It's like
that's another video.
It's a can of worms. It's a whole. I mean, it kind of made me depressed when like reading things about guys who are really advanced in this stuff struggling to understand how to do stuff with. Color is deceptively complex under the hood, but
yeah.
Suffice it to say, we're not going to get the spectrum accurate values here, but we're probably going to get the closest we can with a red, green, blue system, or at least presumably. We also have a sunlight, which has a couple options. We have the angle, which has to do with if we have a larger angle, and let me turn this down to something reasonable. There we go. If we have a large angle, we have basically blurry shadows, and if we have a small angle, we have really sharp shadows. Same thing with the point light, real quick. If I change the radius, that's going to change the blurriness of the fall off here. The bigger it is, usually hold on. Actually, let me delete that light and turn this back up. There we go. I was about to say something wasn't working. So this shadow, if we decrease the radius, just because of the way the physics work, we get a sharper shadow and we can increase the radius. This is approximately, there might be ways to diffuse this, like in real life you'd use a softbox and you would use a material to diffuse the light. In 3D, I think you could potentially do that. And of course, we'll get into mesh lights in a second.
Well, and really the idea of a diffusion in the real world is to change the area of the source, right?
Okay,
so
yeah.
effectively,
It's doing the same thing.
You're doing the same thing.
Okay.
So I would not even think about them as different objects. And in this case, that is one of the good things about working in 3D, is that you don't have to deal with the footprint of the physical things that you would need to accomplish the same goal.
Right.
So when we have a point source in real life, which is most sources, though we are getting panel type sources now, but back in the day, it used to be a point source, because you'd burn a bulb, which has a point, right? And even if it's going through a lens or whatever, it's emitting from one point. And so the idea is to make it softer, you need more area and you need to spread that light out. And so we would put in frames with fabrics and different ideas. But basically the idea is you're making the actual source bigger, because then the source itself is the material in front of it, the diffusion.
Right.
So in this case, you can do that without having a physical footprint of having all of these stands and all of this material that's now in your way. So it is really an advantage to 3D systems here because you don't have to bother with the physical limitations of how to do that.
Right.
You can just make it bigger.
Right, exactly. Oh yeah, and that's actually good to know because I don't know if I ever realized that's like I knew I knew that diffusion diffuse the light. For some reason, I thought I guess that you could diffuse it without increasing the light size. But what you said makes perfect sense.
And I mean, there is differences in materials, and that's something that obviously we can't replicate, at least in this particular method.
Right.
And really what that changes is how that ratio of blur looks.
Mm-hmm.
If you've ever messed with a fast blur versus a Gaussian blur versus a lens blur, and how that feather changes,
Right.
that's really what the main difference between those materials is. But for all intents and purposes, you can do what you need with this system.
Right. So a couple more. The sun, basically, even though the sun in physics is a kind of closer to a point light, we treat it in 3D as if it's all light coming from a single direction, kind of an infinite source, if you will.
Yeah, it's because you don't have millions and millions of miles of space with which to ray trace.
Exactly. And, it works pretty much just the same. Now, I'll get into why we probably won't use the sun, instead use the skylight. But that's, one option. We have the spotlight, which functionally is the same as a point light, but we have basically limited it to a particular size. And that just lets us cast light in a certain direction rather than
well, and more importantly in this case, the negative connotation, right, is
Right.
Now we don't have ray traced bounce light off of things that we don't want the light hitting.
Right, like back here, if we wanted,
right, because if you had a wall behind the light, now you wouldn't get additional shadows and exposure off of the wall. You'd only get it in the direction that you're facing.
Right. And we have a couple more options. We have the spot size, which regulates, the narrowness of our cone. For preview purposes, we can even see it. This can look really cool when mixed with volumetrics, but we may not be able to get to that. And then we also have the blend, which is a little bit separate from the radius. I guess it would simulate, I'm trying to think the physical equivalent, but basically, if we made our radius really sharp, we can actually still have a smooth blend, smooth fall off.
So there is a specific light that can do a similar thing. If you've ever been to a theater and you look at some of their spotlights, or what there is exactly two properties. So your radius is again affecting the overall size of the actual light. So that would be the diffusion. And what you're talking about here is a physical property of when you shoot something through a lens, right? Mm. So the light usually, in most cases, has either a lens in front of it or a type of reflector dish around it.
Right. Yeah.
And we can zoom that source just like you can here and change the angle. But there's a specific type of lens that also allows you to feather the edges. So you can either have a hard cut in a circle or you can blur it, which is a separate property from the actual size of the source, because in theory it's actually the same size. For those curious that want to Google it later, we call those lights ellipsoidals. The main suspect that you would find in theater or on set is by a company called Source 4. And that's just what we call them, as a Source 4. So for anybody super curious, you can go look at something, you can just Google that and figure it out. But these lights are actually, just so you know, probably going to be our workhorse, because these most closely approximate the amount of settings and things that we would get out of a movie light. Right. Because most often we're trying to direct something in one direction with the least amount of spill possible. Right.
And then one other one that you might find pretty useful is the area light. And like the spotlight, it's also directional, and we can point it around. The difference is it tends to be really bright. I forget, there's probably a reason for that. But also we can change basically the size, and we can use either rectangle or square. I guess nowadays we have a couple more. I'm more familiar with these two, but we also have a disc, which is basically just a circle, um, and an ellipse, which of course if it's oval shaped.
Yeah.
So this is probably, I guess, the closest to doing something like, I would imagine the closest to doing something like a softbox. Possibly, however, it doesn't have quite the cutoff that like a spotlight would have.
Sure.
We'd have to set up our own if we wanted something like that.
Correct. So that is a problem we deal with in real life as well, because oftentimes we are, and this is what would approximate mostly how we do a lot of soft light, which is you put a source or sources behind a frame, and that frame holds a fabric usually or type of material to diffuse it. And this is also how we kind of control what some people would call room tone or fill light. Is a lot of times we'll build a softbox like that that hangs over the entire ceiling, right? And that's just to control ambience in a room. And then we would light the subjects with other units. But this allows us to control the contrast of the main unit and then vary the contrast on the fill side, for instance. So we will also be using things like this because, again, this is a better approximation for something than having to set up all of the equipment, in a physical space. This is just replicating all of that equipment with no physical footprint, which is super,
Right.
super cool.
Yeah, 3D. I mean, it's kind of like the painting equivalent to photography. I think it often takes, it gives you almost a little bit too much control, and of course, it makes it a lot of work. But on the flip side, it gives you the ability to have control and just to shape and sculpt things the way that you want to. Um, okay, and see, here's the thing. This, Blender gets updated all the time. I can't remember if I knew about this feature, but we also have a spread feature, which effectively turns this almost into, not quite like, it's not exactly the same settings as like the spot, but that's available too. That's new for me. It's probably been there a while.
It's ironic actually because we have similar things to do this in person. So a lot of times the problem you were mentioning earlier when we deal with this giant source is that it just sort of goes everywhere, right? Like light
Right,
emits in almost 180 degrees from this giant now source. And so, we used to have to set up a lot of flags around the source to
Right.
kind of control that so that we don't get all this random spill. But one of the tools that we use that is most space effective is what we would call an LCD or light control device, but is most people would know it as like a honeycomb or a grid, which is this piece that you can put across the diffusion. It looks literally like a honeycomb. They're usually hexagons, and what this does is it makes that giant source almost a single directional source. So it really only goes forward. And actually what you're doing is basically what those do, because they'll come in different degrees. So you have a 40 degree, a 50 degree, 70 degree, something like that. And it just controls how much extra spill you get.
Right.
And they're very convenient because it doesn't take a lot of space on set for us. So that's actually a really cool feature that we can kind of replicate that idea again with no physical footprint here.
Right. Yeah. That's like I said, I can't remember if that's something I've seen before. It's probably been in Blender in a while. It's just one of those things where you get used to a particular feature set and then they add something and it's like, oh, there's also this. Let me make sure. I think the portal option is for like more yeah. It might be for like 3D portals, which is beyond what we would even need here because it'd be like physically impossible stuff. But I'll have to check that as well.
I think they made a video game about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, there certain game engines will even use that concept where it's like, ways it's great for things like special effects, and that might be what this is. But I'm not sure. That's going to be something I have to research. At any rate, I'm guessing it's something that's less physically based. So we also have the ability to do mesh light. We probably won't need this, but I'll just show it. And that is somewhere in here. There you go. And of course, the value of this is if you wanted to have practical lights in the scene that, let's
Mm.
say it's a nighttime scene and it would be weird if your practical lights were turned off. I mean, not that that would always be the case because, there's ways to get around that, I'm sure. But, if you need it for any reason, or even things like minor lights on like a car or an airplane that has things, probably more so for the art of the movie rather than the lighting. But you know,
Hey, I mean, that's what a lot of times we use practicals for on set anyway. It's just visual interest, not necessarily the amount of intensity that they're giving, just
right,
just to have something there.
right. So we have that, and then we have the background, which of course is a single solid color. Not especially useful, but we can switch this to sky texture and get a lot out of it. I think my settings for the source or something a little bit like this. I had to play around with it, but we have the sun size, which can control like the softness of the shadows, the intensity, elevation, rotation. So of course, the elevation would be how high in the sky it would be, and then rotation would be if we're moving the Earth. Effectively, that's what that would mean. And then the altitude, which probably would be overkill for most things, but maybe if you wanted to simulate it, like being on a really high mountain or something, or perhaps like airplane scene. Most cases, we can probably leave that by itself. But yeah, so those are the options, and also you mentioned flags. Let me switch this back just so we can see. This will be a little bit easier. Somewhere in here. Oh nope, that's not it. There you go. Let's take the saturation out. We will reset these, and same with this one. Let's see. Okay, so let's imagine we create a light, and we'll just use an area light. And let me make this even brighter. Let's say we wanted to create a flag. Well, probably the simplest thing that I found is just to take a typical 3D object. And if you really want to go hardcore, I use I think it's the holdout, which essentially means this is not reflecting anything. Um,
That's what I was wondering is like, couldn't you just jerry rig it by making a black non-reflective source and
right.
sticking it in the way? Because if the physics sim is true, then as far as the lighting goes, then it should just behave like we want it anyway. And
Right.
then you can just set the size and location of that however you want. So we will be doing some of that
Sure.
when we get into it.
Yep. Yep. But yeah, that's the simplest thing. I mean, obviously we could set it with a material that absorbs light, but because this basically absorbs light perfectly, I figured that tends to be the ideal.
That would definitely be the ideal.
Unless you're going for some like, maybe the exception would be if your scene is a film set, then maybe you wouldn't want that. This concludes part one of Lights and Camera. All right. Well, thank you again, Nathan, for showing just all this amazing information. If people want to see your work and all that, how can people find you on the internet?
The best way to kind of keep up with me, honestly, is my Instagram account, which is at Nathaniel Paine _DP. My first name is spelled differently though. It's NATHANAEL PAINE, Nathaniel Paine. And there'll probably be a link to that in the description. I have frames from my video work up there, and I have a lot of my personal photography on there as well, which is, also in my aesthetic realm. And I respond to things very quickly on there. So if anybody has any questions or just wants to talk about any of this stuff, I am a film nerd. So more than happy to have people reach out to me there. And I'll get back as soon as I can. I think I'm also going to give James a link to an interesting project that we can link here as well. But yeah, that's the best way to kind of get a hold of me.
Awesome. Yeah, and the information will definitely be in the description.